welcome everyone. Make sure you can grab some water or coffee or tea as you like. We're going to go ahead and get ready to get started. Welcome to today's session. My name is Tabby Chavis, and I'm the director of our university's National Center for Institutional Diversity and a faculty member in the Department of Psychology and the School of Education. And I'm pleased to welcome you to one programmatic activity that's a part of our research and scholarship seminar series focused on today's topic, which is microaggressions, where we will take up conceptual research and practice implications. So our presenters today are a part of a group of pop-up grant awardees from the National Center for Institutional Diversity, which was a new program that we'd implemented last year as one of our different types of funding mechanisms, specifically with the goal of providing scholars opportunities to address pressing and contemporary social issues in projects that would allow for relatively quick syntheses and analyses that could be turned over to public spaces within a fairly short period of time to complement other kinds of grant funding and funding opportunities that we have that are more traditional, longer term kind of pathways to public dissemination. So the purpose was to allow scholars who engaged in diversity research to engage with the center and to use our center mechanisms to support the dissemination of emerging or re-emerging, in this case, social issues. For today's panel, our scholars take up the concept of microaggressions from different disciplinary, theoretical, conceptual, and methodological lenses. And the reason that our pop-up grant opportunity was focused on that topic, or this particular one, is because it was responsive to a resurgence of scholarly and popular attention to this concept. It was being used not only in the context of higher education, but in many social spaces, both used accurately and used inaccurately to describe a set of experiences of a stigmatization, of devaluation that was occurring, particularly for those who are from historically minoritized or marginalized groups. And the version of the resurgence was calling into question, in some good and not so great ways, so the bad way is calling into question the value of examining kind of this concept. Is this something that's a part of what's in people's heads? Is this something that is real, or people are just soft and too sensitive? But there were also some good calls into question that acknowledges the complexity of this phenomenon, or this concept and the phenomena surrounding it, and calling for more conceptual theoretical interrogation. What is it? What is it not? How does it align with other stigma concepts that we look at in the literature? How do we understand it at an interpersonal or an organizational level? And similarly, there were some good challenges to the field to take up this concept methodologically. Given the complexity of how do we capture it kind of theoretically and understand it theoretically, what are some innovative and effective ways, or even improved ways, of capturing a concept that in itself is a function of transactions between persons and context? Moving away from an objective view that this isn't a microaggression and this is not, with trying to understand a phenomenon that's largely a lived experience, and trying to understand how do we systematically capture that in ways that provide insights for research, but also helps us understand how to engage programmatically in programs, in classrooms, and organizations to take up what we've learned about the concept. And so I'm really pleased today to again introduce three of our larger group of pop-up grantees who again tackle this concept and work on studying this concept from some different perspectives that I think you will enjoy and you will find kind of differently stimulating. And what I hope will happen today is that the different lenses that they take will allow you to apply the work to your respective spaces, whether you're a researcher on this topic, whether you're working in different kinds of academic or organizational contexts, from STEM fields to student affairs to institutional research, that you'll be able to kind of engage both the meaning and the knowledge gained by how people have studied these concepts. So hopefully this will be interactive in that you'll be making connections, and we'll have a part of the session today where you can engage your questions kind of with these scholars as well. So introducing our scholars. Our first presenter will be Professor Rosalie Rolland-Dow, who is an associate professor of education at the University of Delaware. She devotes her work to transforming how we understand and address the educational experiences of minoritized students. Her research, both in K through 12 and higher education, focus on the intersections of social cultural identities with educational equity and opportunity, and on the application of Latina critical race theory to educational problems. She also currently serves as the Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Diversity at the University of Delaware, and that center's mission is on the production and dissemination of scholarship on diversity and equity in higher education. In this capacity, she supports scholars across the university conducting research on diversity and equity issues. Our second presenter will be Dr. Cassandra Rodriguez, who is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. She earned her sociology PhD and master's degree from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and a bachelor's in sociology, as well as gender and women's studies from California State University, Northridge. Her research primarily tackles questions on how citizenship is a negotiated ideal for racialized groups, and how work can be the site of race and gender inequality. Her research has been published in a variety of outlets in social sciences, including Sociology of Race and Ethnicity, the Sociological Quarterly, and Sociology Compass. And our final presenter will be Dr. Alam Lee. Professor Lee is an assistant professor of leadership studies at Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio. Before that, she served as an assistant professor of education at Arkansas State University for 3 years, from 2012 to 2015. Before starting her faculty career, she completed her postdoctoral training in the Graduate School of Education at the University of Pennsylvania and received her PhD in Educational Leadership and Policy Analysis from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her interdisciplinary background enables her to develop research agendas encompassing a wide range of topics, including STEM education for all students, leadership roles for refugees, resettlement and adjustment in a new society towards human rights and social justice, and transformative leadership and cultural changes for diversity and inclusion in various organizational contexts. So the game plan for today will be for each presenter to provide a frame and an overview of their research with a lens for the project that was supported through our grant project program. And then we'll have some time for moderated discussion. I have a few questions that I've prepared, but I'm also going to cede the audience to you to engage with our panelists around questions and really encourage you to think about the connections between kind of the lenses they're presenting and the research findings they're presenting and the work that you might be doing in your various roles here on campus. So without further ado, Professor Rolland-Dow.
So I will begin with 2 stories from my research project. First, listen with me to Precious, a Black female student, in a story we call They Need to Fill a Quota. She said, "I'm in Jake's room. There's another white guy there, and then my roommate Ashley. We were talking about financial aid and how it was expensive to go here. Then Jake turned to me quite aggressively. Without knowing anything about my financial aid package, he said, 'You're probably here on a scholarship just because you're Black, and you don't have to pay anything. I have to pay the whole $23,000, which is not fair.' I asked, 'Why would you think that?' He said, 'Because Black people get scholarships to come here. They need you here.' The other 2 people in the room just agreed with Jake. I felt resentful because I definitely had more to say, more things to combat what they were saying, but I couldn't think of them in the moment. You get that after the argument. You get resentment. So Precious provides one example from my project of a microaggression, which are those subtle, ongoing comments, actions, or even environmental cues that have an aggressive or assaultive impact on minoritized individuals. They are everyday expressions or manifestations of institutional racism, if they're racial microaggressions, and their effect is cumulative. My study also collects stories of microaffirmation, a term coined by Dr. Mary Rowe to describe small acts of inclusion, support, or acts that promote the success of underrepresented groups. So listen with me to Marisol, a Mexican American student. Sorry, I'm having problems with this. As she describes a micro-affirming experience. She said, around the end of my freshman year, I joined this organization, Hablar Sin Parar, which means never stop talking. It's an organization for native speakers to speak Spanish and for students who want to practice Spanish. When I walked into the first meeting of the club, I didn't know what to expect. But right away, they started speaking Spanish. I didn't have to think about switching languages. While I had been on campus before, I didn't speak Spanish at all. When I met people who were Latino on this campus, a lot of them said, I'm the only Hispanic in my class or in my major. It's not that we were outsiders, but the club connected me with people who didn't make me feel as lost. The club just changed the way that I saw this university. So I start with these two stories, and they're a little bit shortened just in the interest of time, because stories are at the heart of this project that I engaged with. In gathering stories then, my purpose is to explore interactions that happen in the course of students' everyday lives related to racial identities. And then to investigate how these experiences influence perceptions of campus racial climate. So I gather stories of microaggressions and microaffirmations. And then critical race theory and lat crit theory provides a framework for how I understand the role of race, how I conceptualize these terms, and then how I analyze and even the methods that I use to study microaggressions and microaffirmations. The research questions that guide this project then, the first one focuses on trying to better understand the nature and the type of microaggressions and microaffirmations that racially minoritized individuals experience on predominantly white universities. And then the second question focuses on better understanding how microaggressions work in tandem with microaffirmations to then influence how students think about the racial climate at their particular university. So the participants that I'm focusing on today are those from racially minoritized backgrounds who are underrepresented at a predominantly white university. And I work with a team of both undergraduate and graduate students, first to help them learn how to conduct qualitative research interviews or to deepen their knowledge of this if they have prior experience. And then once they're prepared to conduct the interviews, they interview students one-on-one, and they solicit 2 stories from each student if the students have the stories to share. One of a microaggression experience, and we don't necessarily say, tell us about a microaggression you experienced. We use more familiar language for students. And then one of a microaffirmation that they may have experienced. And then once they share each story, we have a few follow-up questions that ask them to help us understand what that story, what that experience they told us, what does it indicate for them about the campus climate at their university. So once we have these stories from students, what do they help us understand? How do we analyze the stories, and how are they useful to us? So first and foremost, they help us understand what microaggressions and microaffirmations actually sound like, what they look like, what they feel like when students experience them. What do students do in response, if they do anything in response? Who are the people involved? What is the context for an aggressive or an affirming experience for students? The goal then is that through those stories we can humanize the concepts. We can understand how does a person feel this in their daily life. They also help us understand different types of microaggressions and microaffirmations. So in my research, I'm trying to develop nuance, right? When we say you experienced an aggression, there's literature already existing that outlines different types of aggressions, which you see on the left-hand side of the table. And so we used those different types to then classify the stories that students give us into, is this a micro insult? Is this a micro invalidation, etc. And then we also developed from the project, from the initial set of data that we collected, we developed a typology of microaffirmations, and we defined these terms. Again, trying to bring more nuance and depth to our understanding of these concepts, because they're not all microaggressions and all microaffirmations are not necessarily experienced in the same way. I also cluster stories together to understand specific dimensions of campus climate, right? So that's more addressing the second research question. Or to understand particular types of microaggressions or microaffirmations in a particular context. So what do these look like in a residential space that students experience, or in an academic space, or even sometimes students share experiences that they have that are not necessarily in campus spaces, but are like along Main Street, that they experience as students within that particular context. So for example, here we're looking at several stories that students told happened, of experiences that happened to them in residential spaces, which helped me better illustrate why students might state that they feel a limited sense of belonging in these spaces. Or they might describe feelings of isolation in these settings. So looking at clusters of stories together, we can better understand why they're saying that they're having these experiences, why they're saying that they experience the campus climate in this type of way. So for example, here, Eve shared a story, and these are just quotes from from the stories. So Eve shared a story of being called the N-word as she was literally standing in her room looking out her window, and a group of students looked up and called her the N-word. Shauna shared about her daily practice of sleeping with a headscarf and how this was mocked by a group of students, or they really sort of made a joke out of it. And interestingly enough, again, this happened within her own room with her group of friends. And then Precious told about how, well, Precious was this one of the stories I read earlier about how fellow students aggressively attributed her place at the university to diversity quotas. So then these stories get at the specifics of students' perceptions of campus climate, right? So it's one thing to report that this is how I experience the climate. These stories help us illustrate how it is that students come to perceive the campus climate in a certain way. These clustered stories can also then be used for interventions. That's my hope, that the stories can be used for interventions. So for example, I worked with someone in residence life who took these stories along with some other ones, both aggressions and affirmations, that happen in residential spaces, and she developed a training module for resident assistants within that space. To help them, again, sort of humanize these concepts, to help them illustrate, well, what might a microaggression look like? And then to also start thinking about, you know, if a student comes to me with this experience, what are some ways that I could respond that would feel supportive to the student? So that's one way that the stories can be used in more of a practice-oriented way. We also recorded a few of the stories. We did audio recordings of a few of the stories, and they were played at our local radio station. So there's ways that I'm hoping that the stories can be taken up in real practical ways to inform the campus community. Also, as I said before, after a student shares their story, we ask them, what does this illustrate for you about the campus climate? And then we look across the participants to see, you know, what are some themes that we're noticing here? So some of the dimensions that came up repeatedly at this particular campus were the salience of race for students, racial tension, and racism to the experiences of students. Also what they described as the overwhelming nature or feeling of whiteness on campus and the consequent lack of racial awareness that they experienced. They also talked about a mismatch, and the stories are both from graduate and undergraduate students, and we saw this more with the graduate students, that they talked about the mismatch between the university's diversity, equity, and inclusion statements, literature, etc., and their lived experiences. That the university is saying these things, but what I'm experiencing is actually quite different. And they talked about how frustrating that was. And then also the important role that spaces or organizations, this is focusing more on microaffirmations, created for minoritized students played as sites of affirmation that either offered respite from the campus for students or facilitated the ways they negotiated the campus climate in other spaces on campus. The last step in our interview is that we ask students to think more broadly about all their experiences of microaggressions and microaffirmations and what these suggest about campus climate. So, we say something like, you've only shared 2 stories today. If you think about all your experiences, and then we ask them for some words to describe the campus climate. The majority of students we talked with put more weight on the microaggressions when they were asked to make connections between the racial climate and their experiences. They found that the microaggression stories more closely reflected what they saw as the nature and challenges in the racialized campus climate they experienced. That might be different at other institutions, but that's what we found in this particular institution. I believe in the power of telling stories, and I believe in the power of listening to stories, and I find hope that in centering stories from racially minoritized and other underrepresented groups, it provides a particular starting point for thinking about and addressing racial climate issues in higher education settings. So thank you for listening.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I also want to extend my gratitude to the National Center for Institutional Diversity for providing the pop-up grants to us scholars, but also for allowing this space and this productive conversation that I'm sure we're going to have during the Q&A. I really look forward to that. So my entry into research on racial microaggressions began with my research question, which was, how do Latinx millennials experience belonging in the United States? Between 2015 and 2016, I was conducting a study on how members of Latino mixed status families, that is families that include citizen folks and undocumented immigrant family members, experience membership in the United States. Now, I'm a sociologist, and so I'm drawn to theories of citizenship. And when I was doing this work, I was interested in how, for instance, sociologist Evelyn O'Connell-Glenn thinks about citizenship, because she urges readers and our general audience to think about citizenship beyond a legal or juridical category. In fact, it's something that we police the boundaries of constantly. In her work, she's looked at different settings, the American Southwest, Hawaii, the American South. But essentially her argument is, yes, we are policing the boundaries constantly. And I find that what's fascinating is all these connections between theories of citizenship and space. So certainly by definition, citizenship demarcates inclusionary and exclusionary boundaries. But similarly, according to Henri Lefebvre, space also, quote, embraces some things and excludes others. So I find that Latinx millennials of all immigration statuses, so this was undocumented folks, documented folks, and US citizens, feel a sense of belonging in their Latinx neighborhoods, but report experiencing racial microaggressions in white spaces of Los Angeles. So as a result, I suggest scholars examine how urban or local spaces can impact experiences of racial microaggressions. So what do I mean by racial microaggressions? What's wonderful is there is a very now robust conversation about this across disciplines. Certainly psychologists, education scholars, social scientists are starting and having this conversation that began with Chester Pierce, who is a psychologist. But for me, I borrow from Sue, who tell us that racial microaggressions are the commonplace verbal or behavioral indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults to people of color. So my sample was 42 Latinx millennials who are part of mixed status families. they had one or two undocumented parents, and in most cases, both of their parents were undocumented. Now this works out to 34 citizen young adults. These are US-born Americans, and 8 undocumented or documented young adults. And when I say documented, I refer to young adults who have deferred action for childhood arrivals, which allows some temporary protections for immigrants who came here as youth, eligible youth, driver's license, a work permit, protection from deportation, a program that has been, as probably many of you know, under attack for some time now. These are working class families, working class individuals, and these are emerging adults, 18 to 28, 18 men and 24 women. And they were college goers or college educated for the most part. And I say Latinx, but they're primarily Mexican origin. Some of these folks also identified as Mexican and Salvadoran or Mexican Armenian, which is something that you wouldn't be surprised to see in the context of Los Angeles. So my data on racial microaggressions, not expecting this necessarily, but it emerged from asking Latinx millennials about how they experience belonging in the United States, and very much an open-ended question. So this is a map of Los Angeles, which provides a sense of the racial demographics of the space of the county. Much like many metropolitan areas, Los Angeles is racially diverse, this we know, but also very segregated. In fact, it is one of the most segregated cities specifically for white and Latino communities. Latinos in my study grew up in Latino neighborhoods that were homogenous, largely Latinx, where they reported feeling comfortable surrounded by people of color and especially other co-ethnics. Millennials are also aware of the long history of Los Angeles as being both an immigrant gateway and a settlement location for generations of specifically Mexicans and Mexican Americans. So many participants in the study described the city as progressive, liberal, diverse, comfortable, and welcoming. And really when they imagine spaces outside of LA County, sometimes Orange County, sometimes Northern California, often the Midwest or the South, they think of these places as very hostile to Latinx communities based on experience or based on the stories of their family members or based on things they've heard from their friends. And yet they were experiencing racial microaggressions in the white spaces of their city. And when I say white spaces, I mean a number of public settings, including restaurants, malls, and retail stores. So I'll share with you one experience. And this is an example that is actually rather overt, which I thought would be neat to share because we often think of microaggressions as very subtle, but they don't necessarily have to be, and they can in fact be intentional. So I'll share Teresa's experience. She's a US citizen in her mid-20s. She grew up in a community that remains today 90% Latinx, almost 90% Mexican and Mexican American. It's a community that has been that way for a few decades. And she shared with me a number of narratives of the racial microaggressions she experienced outside of that community. So she shared with me a memory from her childhood that has really stayed with her throughout all these years. And this is when she was about 10 years old, and now she's in her mid-20s. So this was about 15 years ago. So Teresa says, when I was younger, we went to Costco at Burbank, and my dad was waiting for a parking spot. And he saw another one free up, so he went over there, and there was another guy who was coming for it. I guess my dad beat him to it, and this guy started calling us a whole bunch of racist names. He harassed us. He screamed at us. I remember thinking, why is he doing this? Why is he calling us names? Why? Is it just for a parking spot? So I asked, so were you in the car when this happened? And Teresa tells us, I was in the car, and then we started walking to Costco, and he kept saying things. He just kept insulting us and saying, go back to your country. I felt like I was a target. Teresa's childhood experience occurred in a community that is predominantly white, was at the time and is actually today, although there is some demographic change. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with Los Angeles, not that it's necessarily relevant, but Burbank is the sort of epicenter of television recording, and it's like the gateway into Hollywood. Disney Studios, WB Studios is located in this space. But Teresa's example really makes clear how Latinos carry with them this sort of uncertain social belonging. Since citizenship is not something that is a physical attribute, Teresa believes it's her identity as a Latina, a racialized identity, that marks her as someone who might be considered an outsider. So not only do Latino millennials realize that space matters and how they might experience microaggressions, but I should know, and this is important, we gotta think also about how young people resist. They also cope by engaging in a number of avoidance and linguistic strategies to circumvent microaggressions in white space. So this is not always the case, but in Teresa's case, she actually now tends to avoid the city of Burbank, even though this is an experience from about 15 years back. We could dismiss Teresa's experience, and I hope we don't, but we could dismiss it by noting that it was from childhood, and say, make claims about how things must be better now, and those sorts of claims. But French philosopher Henry Lefebvre again reminds us space, quote, bears the stamp of conflict. And that stamp of conflict can begin in moments in childhood, and that stamp sort of stays with us. So when Latinos reflect on moments from years or decades back, that actually continues to color their perceptions of space today. Now, we return to the map of Los Angeles, where we actually see where racial microaggressions have occurred. So I'll give you all a moment to let this sort of marinate a bit. So some of the stars, probably important to know, represent more than one incident. And clearly there is a very striking pattern. As I was telling my colleagues earlier, as someone who grew up in Los Angeles, I started to pick up on this very early on in the data collection, but to map it out is something altogether striking. I'll note that there is an exception, of course, maybe you've caught it yourselves, in Echo Park, which here is a predominantly Latinx community, and specifically Mexican and Mexican American. But even in 2010, the years preceding, and certainly the years following, this is a space that has become heavily gentrified. And although I don't talk about it today, from one young woman, I have some data, Sylvia, who grew up in that community and neighboring communities. And for her, it's very fascinating to see how she's able to reflect on how gentrified space actually shifted her sense of belonging and experiences of racial microaggressions, where she started to, over the years, start to feel more and more like an outsider and experience a lot of forms of othering, even among her peers in these spaces. So something to think about, Echo Park is now approximately 52% white in terms of the residents there. And again, a lot of people have been priced out of that community, partly because of its location, its prime location to get to downtown LA. Also very beautiful, lots of palm trees, Echo Park Lake, really nice attraction for folks. So to recap, when Latinx millennials discuss instances of racism or microaggressions, they do so again in the context of white spaces, where white Americans are, for example, telling them to, quote, go back to Mexico, or asking if they speak English, demonstrating surprise when these folks speak English, asking for their green cards, and so on. And again, because citizenship is not a physical marker, the youth themselves make note of how this is a racialized experience. But in all of this, Latinx millennials resist in a number of ways and demonstrate incredible resilience. And we could certainly talk more about that in the Q&A. I suspect that while my research which was completed in Los Angeles, these experiences are not exclusive to this locale. There's certainly some things that are unique to this city and this county, but recent research by Nilda Flores Gonzalez, a sociologist now at Arizona State University, in her book from 2017, she suggests that Latinx millennials in Chicago are also experiencing space in very similar ways. Her research included US-born citizens, but in my research, undocumented and citizen millennials experience space very similarly, even though the immigration status is very different. So my hope is that this project provides new avenues for research where racial microaggressions, citizenship, and space intersect. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I appreciate the NCID's support this research, developing a comprehensive conceptual model of hierarchical microaggression in higher education setting. And I'm honored to present my work here, and I really appreciate you came to our presentation. And my study focused on microaggression in the hierarchical relationship between stakeholders in college and university setting. So as we know, college and university hire experts in particular area, and many of those experts are PhD and hold other terminal degree. So such highly educated people are assumed to be ethical and professional, and such highly educated people are assumed to strive to cultivate diversity, equity, inclusion. So diversity, equity, inclusion is the major mission of college and university in the United States. So when you visit every university website, they indicate diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we assume they are truly appreciate DEI. We assume. Yeah. So relatively little scholarly attention has been paid to microaggression phenomenon in the hierarchical relationship between stakeholders in higher education setting compared to other types of organizations such as the business sector or public sectors. But reality is 67% of employees in higher education setting experience or witnesses a certain form of microaggression in the hierarchical relationship between stakeholders. And this percentage is almost twice higher than other type of organizations' microaggression phenomenons. So, in the hierarchical structure, microaggression toward the defenseless, less powerful or low-ranked individual referred to as hierarchical microaggression. So this term, hierarchical microaggression, was coined by Young, Anderson, and Stewart in 2015. So this term was recently coined. So most studies focusing on microaggression or bullying do not really use this term, hierarchical microaggression. However, when I analyzed the previous studies related to microaggression or bullying, I found that almost 50% of publication address the hierarchical microaggression phenomenon, which is microaggression toward low-ranked, defenseless, or less powerful individual in the hierarchical relationship between stakeholders. So I found a total of 87 publications related to hierarchical microaggression, and using this publication, I found hierarchical microaggression happen in the relationship between supervisor or mentor and the supervisee and the mentee. So studies show that the perpetrator, supervisor, tended to develop a certain policies favoring their position of power or their self-interest, and using such institutional policy, they interrupt, control, micromanage, and take credit for or steal supervisee's work. And also they use the tradition and culture of their institution. Because we are research-intensive institution, you should publish more, you should obtain external funding. That is your role and responsibility. And because we are teaching institution, you should engage and teach more. And so teaching load, heavy teaching load is the sure thing, you should do this in the name of culture and tradition of their particular college and university. And there is a background why such phenomenon, hierarchical microaggression phenomenon happen, because there is a continuous decrease in revenue source in higher education. And I'm not sure the University of Michigan faced this issue, but most college, public university or private university face significant drop in their financial resources. Because the public university, there is a significant decrease of state funding. And also there is a significant drop of enrollment in teaching institution. Why? Because college-going population is continuously decreased. So facing such a financial difficulty, such hierarchical microaggression phenomenon is kind of pervasive. So more teaching, more research activities. So faculty, particularly tenure track junior faculty, should be involved in more research activity because publication, external grant, those things are related to university ranking and reputation. So if a university gain more ranking and more reputation, they can attract more students, right? So all of them are related to student enrollment and the revenue resources. So because of limited resources, supervisors tend to do not really truly support their supervisees' career success or self-actualization. And they want to strengthen their position of power because supervisors, they also survive in academic field. So they sometimes feel jealousy on their supervisor's success, career success. That is the kind of phenomenon in the hierarchical microaggression in college and university setting. And from the student side, there is a growing diversity in student body. So those diverse students are assumed to be incompetent in classroom, and they tend to be ignored and excluded by instructor or teaching assistants. So they complain, don't assume I'm incompetent, and don't judge me based on my personal background. That is their argument. So such hierarchical microaggression happen. Probably the original source will be continuous decrease in revenue source. Yeah. So that is the hierarchical microaggression, but reverse situation also happen. Supervisor and mentor are victim, and the supervisee and mentee are perpetrator, acting as a perpetrator. So particularly supervisor, upper level administrator, dean, department chair, if they are underrepresented workforce population in the leadership group, such as women and the people of color or women of color, they are assumed to be incompetent by their colleague and by their supervisee, such as their student or their faculty they supervise. And also regarding the tenure track, the faculty line, particularly people of the faculty of color should always advise historical underrepresented students who need more teaching guidance and care, so they have less time to be involved in research activities. And they are also assumed to be incompetent by their students. That is the general pattern in most scholarly articles. And from the student side, there is a background why more students acting as a perpetrator. The skyrocketing cost of college increase consumer mindset among students. So if they are dissatisfied their grade or they don't like the teaching content of instructor, they treat their instructor as a service provider rather than human in a disrespectful manner. So I refer to this phenomenon as contra-hierarchical microaggression because reverse situation happen. Supervisor mentor who has greater power are victim, and supervisee and mentee who have less power are acting as a perpetrator. So both sides happen, contra-hierarchical microaggression and hierarchical microaggression. And another finding, I investigate what are the outcomes of hierarchical microaggression. Not surprisingly, the victim feel increased stress, low job satisfaction, and the burnout. They experience burnout. And that leads to their physical and the mental health problem. And it decreases the productivity. They are less likely to engage with their colleague and the student. And also, many victims try to leave the institution. So such disengagement and high turnover rate lead to the huge economic cost from the university side, according to the studies. So this is the outcome path of hierarchical microaggression. So based on this finding, I would suggest the university's leadership group should conduct the survey, crime survey on a regular basis, and they should consider all possible scenarios rather than we should not assume all supervisor or all mentor are ethical and professional. And at the same time, we should not assume victim, the supervisee are not always the victim. They could act as perpetrator. So without any assumption, the leadership, the Carleton University leadership group should conduct a regular-based crime survey. And even though small percentage was found regarding microaggression, they should investigate to adopt a zero-tolerance policy designed to stop hierarchical or control hierarchical microaggression. And also, this study showed that anyone can be a victim, perpetrator, or bystander in a certain type of microaggression. So every employee and every stakeholder, student, faculty, staff, and administrator should be mandatory to participate in training program. And also, most studies show that marginalized population, like underrepresented population in the workforce, are more likely to victim in the hierarchical microaggression. So such a training program needed to emphasize the reality that marginalized individuals are subjected to bullying or hierarchical microaggression. Yeah. That is the implication for practice. And regarding research, future research, it is important to identify structural relationship among the original factor of hierarchical microaggression or control hierarchical microaggression and the outcome of hierarchical microaggression. And also regarding the outcome, I believe it is worthwhile to develop some mathematical formula that predict the economic cost associated with the hierarchical microaggression. Yeah, because from the victim side or perpetrator side, both sides, we need to see the both sides.
So you can see that we've been provided lots of food for thought for the different ways that we might conceptualize and think about kind of the lived experience of microaggressions, as well as their implications, impacts on people, impacts on institutional kinds of loss, impacts on communities as well. So I guess one of the things that I wanted to kind of, and I had the pleasure, I will say, of talking with this group this morning, and reading their papers, so had a chance to dig more deeply into their work. But hopefully, the questions that I'll share will resonate with some of yours as well. Given the different ways that you have presented this concept of microaggressions, again, going back to our original premise about this kind of concept being kind of under, am I not talking loud enough? Under threat or under attack for, one, the kind of public way in which it's discussed can be confusing. Micro can sometimes be, confused with minor, like something that's micro versus major, when in fact people who are studying it don't think about microaggressions as not necessarily having large impact. In fact, it's more common to experience microaggressions than more overt, large kind of experiences as well. So that's one kind of challenge, is in the understanding of it. But I guess I would wonder, from the perspectives of your different work, what are the biggest kind of conceptual and research challenges that you've had around taking up this concept? How has this concept been received in the way that you have presented it in the higher education, community, organizational space? I don't know if you can take this if you want to.
Well, the one thing that, is this on? Yeah, sorry. The one thing that I would say that I've really emphasized in conceptualizing microaggressions and microaffirmations is that they need to be understood not only as the personal interaction, right? I start there with the stories and experiences of students. But if the only analysis we conduct is at that level, I think we miss something in the definition of microaggressions. So for example, if microaggressions are manifestations or consequences of racism, when we're talking about racial microaggressions, how can we communicate that, right? So what do the lived experience, what do those stories suggest? So in my case, I look at campus climate and not only pull out the themes, but some of the analytic work that I'm doing is also to think about what are the ideologies and mindsets that are behind the microaggression experiences or the microaffirmation experiences. So I think that's really important, and I think the term microaggressions has taken on a lot of currency, and so you hear about professional development work with microaggressions and that sort of thing. And one of my cautions in that work is that we not dilute the concepts, so that, you know, if I just improve my interactions at this interpersonal level, then I've taken care of it, right? Yes, your own growing awareness is important, but I think understanding the mindsets and ideologies is also important as well. So I think conceptually, how do we keep that complexity in the concepts is one of the things that I constantly continue to strive for in both the methods that I use, but also then in the way the work is taken up by other people. I don't know if that stretches, there's one over there too.
Oh,
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, this is a wonderful question because we could talk about this all evening, right? So as a sociologist, I come into this work knowing that actually sociologists have said little about racial microaggressions compared to, let's say, psychologists. Mm-hmm. We're kind of late to the game. I know David Embrick and colleagues, they put together this special issue in 2017 where they tried to bring the conversation, the intersections of psychology and sociology. And one critique that sociologists have that I don't necessarily agree with just yet perhaps is the critique has been that maybe in psychology there's not a connection between microaggressions and structural racism or systemic patterns, but becomes really clear actually in all this work, and of course there's so much now, is that yeah, there are these patterns, and to this question of are microaggressions real, or are what marginalized folks experience accurate or credible or real. I think what's the trouble with believing folks who are very intimate with their experience and oppression, right? Why doubt what they have to say when they should sort of know what their experiences is? We had a very productive, I think, conversation about uncertainty. So in researching racial microaggressions, it's not uncommon for, let's say, an interview subject or a research subject to perhaps even doubt an experience as racially motivated or as a racial microaggression. And the research tells us that's common because some of the microaggressions are very subtle. And also because if you're coming from communities where you are an immigrant or a child of immigrants, your way to cope with these types of things is to try to sort of look past it, have a more optimistic viewpoint, initially claim that you don't experience these things. And I think for communities where they have immigrant ties, or communities that are marked as un-American or non-American, so let's say in my case Latinx millennials, in a way for them to combat racial microaggressions, to say this is a racial microaggression or this is racism, I think sometimes the fear is then you're further marked as un-American to even have that critique. And I think that's a challenge in even thinking about how do we combat this at an individual level? And then how do we combat this at a larger structural level or policy level? Well, that is a huge challenge, especially if we're thinking about broad urban or community settings, right? That's something that I've been forced to think about in this context, which I'm grateful for, but very, very difficult challenges here.
When I analyze most study regarding hierarchical microaggression, I only see the victim's perspective. But I would like to see what are the perspective of perpetrator or bystander. So single study, most single study do not show the bigger picture of hierarchical microaggression phenomenon. That is the I feel a challenges. I want to hear what's the perspective of perpetrator, potential perpetrator or bystander. That is the one of the challenging I felt when I analyzing 87 publication. And I think only one study show all the various stakeholder, perpetrator perspective and the victim's perspective. And other than one study, all study only describe the victim's experience, not really the suspected perpetrator or bystander's perspective. So I may not see the bigger picture of hierarchical microaggression phenomenon in higher education setting. That is the one of the challenging. And the second challenging is regarding hierarchical microaggression, depending on the institution type. For example, R1 university, research intensive institution or teaching institution like small liberal arts college and community college. And depending on the type of post-secondary institution, the detailed construct of hierarchical microaggression phenomena could differ. But most studies do not really specify what type of institution they are investigating. That is another challenge I felt.
And then I think I also have a question, I do have a question, about the different methodologies that you took up both either in your analysis of the literatures that you looked at and in your own kind of methodologies. As people, I know the audience here is a mix of people who are interested in both understanding, capturing, acting on this knowledge. Your perspectives and experiences around the complexity of capturing kind of these concepts. So as someone who conducts climate surveys, I think about the strengths and the limitations of kind of survey items and capturing experiences that may be very subtle and hard to name. I'll give you an example just so you can have a sense of what I'm talking about. I was doing a research study with a local high school in Michigan, and it was working with a youth group around this concept of the achievement gap. And so one of the questions, or one of the themes that was coming up in the school, is the way that counselors and teachers were kind of directing kids, formal and informal tracking. And so I talked about, with one child, the idea of asking questions about, have you been discouraged from taking courses that are too hard for you? And so the minority students in this school were actually not in the same tracks in math, and even though they were performing well, they weren't college going because they weren't taking the right math. And so this is idea of like who's being tracked into what. And so this one young woman said, no, I've never been discouraged from taking courses that were too hard. And so, I was like, okay, your lived experience. But then, a few moments later she said, but I was encouraged to take easier classes. So it was like, oh, and so I was like still listening again, not trying to impose an experience to say, well, that's actually the same thing. But I let her keep saying it, and so encouraging was a more positive framing for her because there's a burden in naming something, I think as you alluded to, as something that's racially motivated. So she would rather say I was not discouraged, but I was encouraged. But then throughout the kind of discussion, she kept commenting on it. She was like, well, I probably wouldn't have done well in that course anyway. And then a few minutes later, she was like, well, she could have let me try. And so you could tell, so one of the costs of microaggressions is also, one, the subtlety in them make them hard to capture, but the rumination around them and meaning making that you continue to make is one of the costs. And so I guess I wonder, what are the kind of strengths and the kind of greatest learnings from the methodological lens that you take? What are the ways in which you study these things that you're still kind of grappling and struggling with, given, the very kind of individualized, personalized nature of it, but also given the kind of complexity, subtleness, sometimes not subtle, of the concept itself? How do you think about capturing it? And I won't say accurately, I mean accurately meaning appropriately honoring the person's experiences, not whether it's right or wrong. And anyone can start.
there's a lot I could say about methodology. Two things that come to mind is that I find that students, after they share the story, as they're talking about it, they're like, I've been asked, well, do you feel like you're re-traumatizing students, by asking them to share a story? And more often than not, what I find is that students say something like, wow, I hadn't told anybody that story before. Like there's this, they're not saying like, oh, it was great sharing my story with you, but they are expressing this sense of relief in like processing, having the opportunity to process the experience, and to think about it in this way, and sometimes being given a language for then talking about it. Even though, like I said in the interview, we're not saying, tell us about a microaggression. We do frame this, like they do come to learn of those terms through the study if they are not familiar with the terms aggression and affirmation. So I think that the act of telling stories tends to be, for the most part, more healing than it is re-traumatizing. The other thing that I would say is a major challenge to this work is time. That sometimes I wish, the time from when the interviews are conducted and then they're transcribed and then we're restory them to create these vignettes. Like by that time, like students have graduated. Like I wish there was a quicker way to bring the stories back to the students. And we do share the stories back with the students and ask them, like, is this accurately reflecting your experience? Because we want to make sure that, in reconstructing the stories that we are really accurately describing what they wanted to share. But time is a huge issue. So I don't know how to create more things that are more dynamic and capture student stories and then have a quicker way of working with those students that have experienced this phenomena. So that's one of the challenges of methodologically collecting these stories.
Sorry. I'd have to agree that I have this fear, this hesitation of conducting an interview where you're inviting the participant to talk about experiences that may be very triggering or unpleasant. Although I agree that I think it can be cathartic in a way, especially if it's the first time that they're actually sharing the story, right? I think there's a lot of power in that. I think my thought moving forward on these methodological challenges is if I could do it all over again, what would I do? Or if I did a new project, what would I do differently? And something that I think brings me a lot of joy is thinking about how could I also, so I do maybe let's say an interview of sorts, but also think about other ways of storytelling. And so it's not an area that I know, but even using something like cognitive maps may or may not be something that is productive in doing an interview, for example, especially if I'm looking at space, right? That could be in the university setting, that could be Las Vegas, which is where I'm now located. But the other thing I was thinking about in your comments is, so some of my work is on discourses on anchor babies, which is very damaging rhetoric. A lot of damaging rhetoric has been directed to the parents of these young adults. And so I know that there are some scholars, some of which are in education, who have encouraged the academic audience to think about looking at racial microaggressions with immigrant communities, with undocumented communities. And informally in conversations I've had with some participants, sort of off the record, just in conversation, is their parents are also experiencing racial microaggressions, but what does that look like for someone who, let's say, doesn't know English, and so they're not translating what the perpetrator is saying, right? And so that presents some challenges for thinking about how that is experienced for the target, right? And the other thing is, even while thinking about issues of, let's say, English language fluency, the children of these parents, for example, will also be clear to note that they're also not stupid. They also know if someone is being hostile towards them, even if they don't know what they're saying. So I say this is a way to perhaps just think about other work, perhaps directions that I'll take maybe sometime in the future.
So following up the comment of my colleague, several studies use the interview technique, the phenomenology approach to explore microaggression. So I would suggest perhaps the future study needed to adopt a mixed method using both qualitative component and quantitative component. So it would be important to make a quantitative relationship between some demographic characteristics, race and ethnic background, and the microaggression phenomenon. So mixed method needed to be adapted to generalize the results. Yeah, because we discussed the generalization issue in the morning. So quantitative method or mixed method technique needed to be adapted in future study when somebody study microaggression. So based on the synthesis of several study basis on phenomenology studies, we may need to develop some survey instrument, and we may distribute such survey instrument to various areas, California, New York City, and the Midwest and South. And then we need to quantify the relationship between race, ethnic background, or other demographic background, and hierarchical microaggression phenomenon. Yeah, that would be the consideration, how we can improve the methodological issue in microaggression studies.
I want to also see if there are any audience questions before I continue. Yes, and would you mind projecting, since we don't have a mic that can reach you?
For the campus climate studies.
Can you stand so we can see you? Thank you.
For the campus climate studies, I was just wondering if you've given these campus climate reports back to the campuses and what the reactions have been, and if your research is also focusing on techniques that the campuses can implement to improve the climate.
The hard part, right?
Yeah.
What does this mean for practice? So yes, to the first question in terms of how are we giving this back to the campus, we've had a campus climate forum that actually included both survey data and data from this particular project. I just finished preparing a report for the graduate office because the second round of data collection involved the experiences of graduate students. And of course made some suggestions for implications, but want to have conversations around that report to think about what are the implications of this work. So now that we know this, now that we know these are themes and these are experiences, how can we get this information out within the campus? I already mentioned the one experience working with someone in residence life. I also worked with a professor in art who was, she had a course on art and social activism, and so she utilized some of the stories for the students to think about how can we use art to communicate the content of these stories. So I'm open to working with anybody on my campus that wants to take up the stories. My hope also had been that we could create a listening archive somehow, and I still have that as a strategy for really using the stories for people to listen to them. Because again, I think that the stories really humanize the concepts and the experiences. So I want to explore that further as a way to expose more people to, who may not know anything about what a microaggression or a microaffirmation is. I haven't been as successful in re-engaging the students who told the stories. My visualization of the project was that once we had the narrative, they would actually read their narrative and we would record it. But like I said, it takes a while to turn over, and it was harder to get them to engage in that way. But I can think of, for example, engaging the theater department to do dramatic readings of these stories. So that's sort of down the road. I think there's a lot of potential there for taking the stories back, and also thinking about how can we collect stories, of different people on campus, right? Staff or faculty who also experience aggressions and affirmations.
Okay, one thing that I noticed from your work and your work, Rodriguez, was that where people were experiencing affirmation were in segregated places. So that is clear and troubling at the same time.
Affirmation or aggression? I'm sorry.
Affirmation, but the affirmation was experienced in the black group.
Oh,
or
okay,
in
so
the
by
Latino-
segregated, I see what you mean. Okay.
You know, so
Yes.
so back in your own group, you're affirmed.
Mhm.
In LA County, only outside your area is when you are not affirmed.
So, what I'll say about that is that that was a pattern in my data that I think is worthy of further investigation, but the affirmations tended to come more, not exclusively, but more from other people of color or in these spaces, right? In the Black Graduate Student Association, in the Black Cultural Center, in the International Student House for students who were international students. But there were moments when it could be a white student, for example, in a classroom, a white peer, and a black student or a Latinx student experience an affirming experience, or a white professor or or staff member. So they do happen, but they were less predominant, and it is troubling, right? If the affirmations are not as common in the spaces where students spend more of their time, that definitely is problematic, and that's something that needs to be communicated back to the campus as well.
So Dr. Wright, you did allude to this notion of if someone says they experience a microaggression, then why debate it? And then Dr. Lee, you did talk a little bit about Dr. Daryl Sue's work on microaggressions. But I'm wondering, Dr. Daryl Sue has this list of legitimate psychological dilemmas that people go through as a result of experiencing microaggressions. But then what I constantly run into is people saying, but refuting it. Saying that's not, there's these white papers. So in your work, did you come across anything, either way, like that either supports the psychological dilemmas or not, of people who experience microaggressions?
Absolutely, and that's part of the emotional burden, right? Because we had been talking about earlier, and that's why I like one of the articles by Sue and colleagues is that example of moving to the back of the airplane, right? Was that racially motivated? But what was a privilege for me as a researcher in doing these interviews is for some of these young adults, I'm seeing it happen in real time where they are thinking through all the different types of reasons why X happened, and they come to conclude or had been concluding, I really do think it was a racial microaggression. I really do think that was racially motivated, and sometimes it's very clear. Sometimes there's a sort of comparison group in a sense, in a social setting, in a public setting, where they can say that didn't happen over there with those folks, but it happened to us. But that is very much the emotional burden, right? Trying to determine, did that just happen to me? What is this, and what's the message here, right? In one of the passages I talked about with my colleagues earlier is one young man, wondering, is it because I'm young? Is it because I'm brown? And young adults can do that. Is it because of this? Is it because were we too loud? And so ultimately, that's part of why microaggressions should be researched, right? The uncertainty is actually okay in the sense that the social world is just filled with these uncertainties, but in the case of racial microaggressions, it's people of color that have to do that very burdening thinking about it, and don't have the privilege to just kind of walk away from it and sort of put it to the side in a way.
Yeah, following on, my colleague's comment, the previous studies, some research evidence to show that someone who experience the victim, so someone who are the victim tend to be bully somebody, so microaggress somebody. So someone who are being bullied tend to bully someone. Yeah. So, and another research evidence show that socially marginalized individual tend to be bullied in the victim. So combining those two research evidence, we may need to identify the original risk factor, antecedent risk factor to prevent the microaggression or hierarchical microaggression. So what are the antecedent risk factors that lead to the hierarchical microaggression? Maybe we do not know. Maybe it's just loop, revenge, or so it is this question.
I'm curious about what kind of pushback that you described getting. You said you got pushback.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
So it's more so over time. And so when we talk about like some of the psychological dilemmas are like intrusive cognitions and false positives, right? And so people will say, well, that's just, that's not true. Is there any proof that over time people who experience microaggressions have impaired mental health that is at a higher rate than people who don't experience them over a higher period of time? And so as, white papers are written to show that microaggressions are just something that people made up and it's nothing that actually negatively impacts people. And then you have work like Dr. Sue that's like, that's not true. And so I was wondering, just in your work, did you see anything that went one way or the other?
I would say there's some interesting, so in addition to the work by like my esteemed scholars, colleagues here, there's also some work in the areas of public health and like showing the physiological impacts. So people like Enrique Nebelet, James Jackson, who's a psychologist but works in the field of area of health, have looked at the physiological impacts of these kinds of experiences using different kinds of methodologies, including experimental methodologies where you actually see people experiencing, you see the interaction that they're experiencing, as well as longitudinal studies where people are reporting on their experiences, and people who report more on those experiences are showing different kinds of physiological symptoms. Even starting in Nebelet's work is interesting because he starts his work with college students, showing that some of the precursors to later kind of aging-related diseases began during the college period, and more for students of color who are reporting these kinds of discriminatory experiences. So I think that, going back to your comment about mixed methodologies is really providing us with a nice set of lenses for how do we understand the day-to-day lived experience, but then how do we understand the cumulative impacts over time, not only on performance and engagement, but also on psychological and physical health. So I think there's growing kind of work in different disciplinary spaces, which is an exciting part of this panel, multiple disciplines that bring that, and if you bring that pieces of the puzzle together, it gives you a more robust picture of how this phenomenon is impacting people.
And just to say really quickly that Dr. Chester Pierce, the person who coined the term in the 1970s, was very much interested in the physiological impact. So, and also Daryl Bing-Su, he's not the primary editor, but a book just came out on microaggression theory that I believe has some chapters on some of what you're interested in. I can give you that citation.
Thank you.
I saw some hands or somebody over here.
I'll give a little context. Thank you all so much for all you shared. I think it's been really amazing to see sort of this concept in all these different ways. So I work with actually an educational theater company on campus. So we're part of like a first-year mandate to talk about bystander intervention using sort of forum theater, playback theater, and participatory theater with new students to think about how to intervene specifically in situations surrounding microaggressions. And so I guess my question sort of comes as more anecdotal and sort of a shift in context. So we're sort of in a very rapid, somewhat jarring, drastic socio-political context shift, which shifts how we have conversations about microaggressions. And I think some of this, I just wanting to know sort of your experience with that, but some of the things we've noticed is sort of disruption and sort of a linear, progressive understanding of progress especially in an educated, progressive setting. And so how does the discussion of microaggressions disrupt that? And I think the other thing is sort of the perceived and somewhat actual like shift in overtly aggressive acts of violence, right, in college campuses. And so oftentimes we're trying to think, how do we balance talking about microaggressions with this shifting context? And so I'm wondering your thoughts on that.
Also so much.
regarding the intervention to prevent microaggression, I think university require diversity course in every discipline. And for my undergraduate degree, I studied the business, and business program does not have the core course of diversity. What I experienced is cost-benefit analysis and financial and accounting, those kind of number-based courses. They don't really teach what is the diversity, how we can collaborate together. Yeah. But the 21st century, one of the 21st century skill is diversity skill. So every student should prepare for working with diverse people. That is the required skill for 21st century learner. So that's why every discipline, business school and the STEM field, and of course education, sociology and social science, every field at least require one course that address the diversity issue that include microaggression. And I believe the STEM field, they don't really offer some diversity course. They are doing STEM-related content. And my experience, education, sociology, psychology, those disciplines really focus on diversity issues. The major content of curriculum is the diversity and social justice, but not every discipline. So that is why this kind of issue happen in college campus. So that is my idea of how we can prevent microaggression through intervention.
First, thank you for your comment. I'm very interested probably to hear more a bit about participatory theater and how that's used as a way to address or prevent or address microaggressions. Your comment got me thinking about, because you mentioned the election, or maybe you didn't mention the election, I just went there. Yeah. I'm also going to circle and be recorded, so, I think about how rhetoric leads to violence or the threat of violence, right? So I was doing this in 2015, 2016, and this was during the election cycle. At that point, a president had not been selected. But the people in my study were very cognizant of the very racist rhetoric that was proliferating, right? And also how that sort of gave like a free pass or emboldened some people to adopt that rhetoric for themselves. So the example I'll share because it was at a university setting, and I won't name the institution, but a couple of young adults who I had talked to talked about being in line for a sporting event, at a college sporting event, being in line, and the influence of alcohol, I think, is very, very threatening in this context of racial microaggressions or racism or violence, right? Because there was a young man, presumably a college student, who was saying very threatening things and was saying, "Oh, this political candidate, he's right. Mexicans are terrible. And I tell you right now, if I see a Mexican, I'm going to stab him. I'm going to stab him," he said. And these are two Latinx young people who are Mexican Americans, and they are in front of this person, this college student who's saying this. And the college student is lacking a lot of self-awareness, not really realizing maybe who's around him, but there's a connection. I mean, absolutely. And so I don't want to say now more than ever, because these narratives have always been around, right? But there is certainly something to this moment that really brings attention to the need to these types of conversations and interventions.
I would say go ahead. Give you the last question.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on what you just said about the exploration of rhetoric leading to violence. And I'm just wondering if there are exactly studies that have made this connection between microaggression and violence. Like, have they actually collected data like that?
Good question. Yeah.
I'm not coming across.
Yeah, me neither.
And if there is, then we'll probably see it in a couple of years, right? If in terms of this moment, right? But I'm racking my brain trying to think. Okay. I'm not sure.
And there certainly is. I mean, I have some new data, so I was lucky enough to be able to collect data, longitudinal data and cross-sectional data with students both prior to the election in the several years, and then students of the same age group, post-election. And so one of the things that, in some preliminary analyses that I'm finding is that some of the same kinds of interpersonal climate experiences that students are reporting seem to have a larger impact. Impact because students may have some fears that work that might be like, that's just a stupid person, is more translated into fears that stupid person's kind of remarks might actually translate into action, more so than the cohorts so first and second year students who were reporting on that after the election. I have data for first and second year students 3, 4, 5 years before the election, where the relationship seems a little bit different between some of those same experiences. And so I'm still probing some of the data, but that's one of the possible explanations that I was coming up with, that why should it be more strongly related if the characteristics of the students are not different and the like? It could be because they think that those interactions might be more high stakes in terms of what they might translate into versus an unpleasant interaction that's a stupid person, versus people who say stupid things sometimes act on them. And we've seen that in the news, we've seen that on campus. So the stakes might be perceived as higher, which is more stress, which is a different construction of the campus climate too.
And I just want to add to that, because you mentioned fear, that I think that really relates to what you were saying about the current context, and that there's fear both on the side of, experiencing those racial microaggressions, but also what happens when you're called out, right? And that there's a lot of racial stress that I think in the current context has only been heightened. So I think going back to how do we intervene, right? What are the types of work that we need to do with students or faculty or staff or whatever other context we're thinking about this? And I think part of the work is around racial literacy, and racial literacy. Howard Stevenson at University of Penn has done some work related to managing racial stress. And racial stress is not only as receiving microaggressions, right? But when you are called out for something, or when you're the bystander, how do we manage that racial stress? And I think your work with theater could be helpful there, right? That, if you witness a microaggression, what can you do in that stressful moment? And I think that's really important work, because part of the definition of microaggressions is that they're stunning. And when you are stunned, you're often frozen. And that can be witnessing one, it can be being called out for one, or it can be being the victim of one. But in all those situations, you're like, all of a sudden, I don't know what to do, right? So how do we practice managing that racial stress? How do we practice possible ways of responding? So I think it's about all those players and all those scenarios being part of that process.
Thank you. I'm going to have to close this out because we're 3 minutes past our witching hour, which is like anti-Michigan time-ish, right? But I want to, what is this Michigan time thing? I want to thank you all for coming, and hopefully this is stimulating part of a conversation that can continue in your different spaces. I would like to say that we will be, through our new briefs platform that in collaboration with Michigan Publishing, we will be disseminating these papers, publishing and disseminating these papers through our platform called Currents, which is our new kind of journal of briefs that are intended for academics, policymakers, anyone interested in trying to understand how research and implications for practice around these particular topics. So they will be kind of the first set of papers that we disseminate under that platform. And so I want to thank you all again. Please join me in thanking you.